times since 1950.
Wow, that's a lot.
H.V. Kamath, another member of the Constituent Assembly, made a comment about it.
What did they say?
Dr. Ambedkar is dead, and the articles are very much alive.
Okay, bit pointed, but it highlights that difference in vision versus reality.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so the courts can review this.
Yes.
But what are they looking for?
Well, the Bomai case laid down those guidelines.
Right.
They said the president's decision has to be based on facts.
Not just a whim.
No, not at all.
So the central government has to prove their case.
Right. And the courts can actually reinstate a dismissed state government.
If they feel it was done improperly.
Exactly. They act as a safeguard.
So they make sure this isn't misused.
That's the goal.
Okay, so lots of checks and balances to prevent president's rule from being misused.
It's all about balance.
We've talked about war, rebellions, turmoil at the state level.
Lots of crises.
But what about an economic crisis?
Yes.
What happens if the nation's financial stability is at stake?
Well, that's where the third type of emergency comes in.
The financial emergency.
Covered under Article 360.
Okay, when can that be declared?
When the president is convinced that the financial stability or credit of India is threatened.
So that could be the whole country?
Or just a part of its territory, yep.
And what about the process? Is that similar to the other emergencies?
It is.
Proclamation by the president?
And then parliamentary approval.
Got it. And once it's declared?
That's when the central government gains some serious financial control.
Over the entire country?
Specifically over the states.
Oh, so they can.
Control state budgets.
Wow.
Direct states to cut spending.
And even.
Reduce the salaries of state government employees.
That seems like it would cause a lot of tension.
It could, definitely. It's one reason why India has never actually declared a financial emergency.
Never?
Nope. Not even during the 1991 economic crisis.
Wow, that's interesting.
So it's more of a last resort measure.
Like breaking glass in case of emergency.
Exactly.
It's still important to understand.
Absolutely. Especially for the UPSC exam.
It's all about those nuances, right?
It is.
Well, for everyone listening, even those not taking the exam, I think this is valuable stuff.
It is, definitely.
It affects us all, these provisions.
Especially in times of crisis.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today.
We have.
National emergency.
President's rule.
Financial emergency.
The big three.
We've talked about how they work, the effects they have, and the criticism surrounding them.
It's important to understand all sides of the issue.
It's all about how India, as democracy, responds to those critical situations.
And the balance of power between the central government and the states.
Right, that balance is so important. But before we wrap up this part of our discussion, let's dig into those criticisms surrounding these emergency provisions a bit more.
Yeah, let's do it.
They sound like they could be pretty powerful.
They are powerful, for sure, designed to be.
So what are the main concerns people have raised about them?
Well, one of the biggest worries is that they could threaten the whole idea of federalism in India.
So undermining that autonomy of the states.
Exactly. Think about it. During a national emergency or president's rule, the central government really takes charge.
Yeah, they do.
It's like a temporary shift towards a more unitary system, which is the opposite of federalism.
Makes sense. And what about the concentration of power?
Oh, yeah. That's another big concern.
It's all in the hands of the president and the cabinet, right?
Right.
Even if it's temporary, couldn't that lead to problems?
It could. Some argue that it could lead to authoritarian tendencies.
Especially if those powers are misused.
Exactly.
And what about the impact on individual rights?
We've seen how some rights are automatically suspended.
Or can be suspended during emergencies.
Right.
And that obviously raises concerns.
Definitely. Concerns about human rights violations, the erosion of those democratic principles we hold dear.
It seems like there's always this tension, right?
There is.
Between national security and individual rights during emergencies.
It's a tough one.
And it's not like these criticisms are new.
Nope, not at all.
Even during the drafting of the Constitution, people had concerns.
Absolutely.
Some members of the Constituent Assembly even spoke out against them.
They did.
What did they say?
Well, some worried that these provisions would basically destroy federalism.
Making the union government too powerful.
Right, turning the president into a dictator. Oh, wow.
They feared states would lose their financial independence completely.
And that fundamental rights would become meaningless.
They saw it as undermining the entire democratic foundation.
Those are some strong words. They were pretty worried about potential abuse.
They were. One member even called these provisions a chapter of reaction and retrogression.
Wow.
Saying it would lead to a police state, a totalitarian state.
Where individual rights are always under threat.
That was the fear.
So even back then, there was a lot of debate about these provisions.
Definitely.
And it's fascinating to see how those concerns have stuck around.
It's because these are fundamental questions about power, democracy, individual rights.
Stuff that's always going to be relevant.
Absolutely.
And it reminds us that we can't take these things for granted.
No, we have to be vigilant.
Make sure these powers, while necessary, are used responsibly.
And with respect for our values. Okay, before we move on, let's go back to those early arguments against these provisions. What else did they say during the drafting of the Constitution?
A lot of them saw these provisions as just a bad idea.
Why?
They thought it was a step away from federalism and democracy.
The very principles they were trying to build.
Exactly. They worried about giving the central government so much power.
Even for a short time.
It could set a bad precedent, you know?
Like it could open the door to authoritarianism.
Right. And remember, they were writing this right after British rule.
Where individual liberties were often suppressed.
Exactly. They don't want to recreate that.
So they were afraid of a system where those in power could easily use emergency provisions to silence dissent.
Or to take away those hard-won rights and freedoms.
So at the core of it, it's about power.
It is.
The potential for it to be misused, to be turned against the people it's meant to protect.
That's the danger.
And that's why we have to be cautious.
Always.
Okay, we've talked about the courts stepping in.
They're vital.
But are there any mechanisms within the Constitution itself that limit the central government's power during these emergencies?
That's a great question.
I try.
You're thinking like a true constitutional scholar. And yes, the Constitution does have built-in checks to prevent abuse.
Okay, good. Maybe we can explore those a little more.
We can definitely do that.
But first, for our listeners new to UPSC prep, this topic is super important for the exam.
It really is.
But it's not just about memorizing articles and clauses.
No way.
It's about understanding these complexities.
Of power, democracy, governance, all that.
And for everyone else who's listening, this isn't just about the exam.
It's about being informed, right?
Right. This stuff affects all of us.
Especially during times of crisis.
Exactly. So we'll be back in a bit to continue our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. So we were talking about how the Constitution has those built-in checks, right?
Right, to prevent those emergency powers from being abused.
Like having a powerful tool, but you need safety features.
Exactly. So let's break those down a bit.
Well, for both national emergency and financial emergency.
Those declarations need parliamentary approval.
Right, which means the executive branch doesn't have all the power.
It's not just the president deciding.
Nope. The elected representatives have to weigh in.
Okay, that makes sense. But what happens after the emergency is declared?
You mean if Parliament decides it's not needed anymore?
Yeah, can they step in?
They can. For national emergencies, the Lok Sabha
That's the lower house of parliament.
can actually pass a resolution to revoke the emergency.
And the president has to follow that.
They do.
So even during a crisis, those democratic principles are still working.
They are.
That's good to know.
It's a pretty big limitation on the executive's power.
Okay, so what about president's rule? Can a state challenge that?
They can. They can always go to the Supreme Court.
If they feel it was imposed unfairly.
Right. Remember the Baumai case?
Yeah, we talked about that.
The court laid out those guidelines for using president's rule.
So it can't be used arbitrarily.
No, there have to be valid reasons.
So the courts are there to protect against misuse.
They are a safeguard.
But what about the length of these emergencies?
How long they can last?
Yeah, can they go on forever?
Well, it depends.
On what kind of emergency?
Yeah. For a national emergency, it's 6 months at first.
And then it can be extended.
It can, but it needs parliamentary approval each time.
So every 6 months?
Yep, every 6 months they have to reapprove it.
Okay, so it should go on for a while.
It could, theoretically.
But Parliament is constantly checking in.
Exactly.
What about president's rule?
That's a bit shorter.
How long?
6 months initially, same as national emergency.
Okay.
But the maximum is 3 years.
And then it has to end.
It does.
So that normal functioning of the state government?
That has to be restored after 3 years.
Okay, so there's a definite time limit. Makes sense.
It does.
But what about the financial emergency?
Yes, that one's different.
You said earlier that once it's declared, it just keeps going?
Until the president revokes it, that's right.
There's no time limit.
No time limit.
Wow.
It shows how seriously they took that kind of emergency.
Yeah, that's a lot of power.
It is. But remember, it's never been used.
Right, not even in 1991.
Nope.
So it's more theoretical than practical?
It is, but it's still important to understand.
Especially for those UPSC folks.
They need to know this stuff inside and out.
It's all about the why behind the rules, not just the what.
Exactly.
But for everyone else, This is valuable knowledge, too.
It is.
It's about knowing how India responds to these really difficult